Thank you for joining us today. I am Heath Henning, and this is Truth Watchers Podcast. Here we have a focus on apologetics and expository teaching so we can uphold the words of 3 John verse 4. I have no greater joy than to hear that my children walk in truth. Also, check us out at truthwatchers.com, where we have a lot more materials available, articles, and free ebooks. If you enjoy these podcasts, hit the follow or subscribe button and share them with your friends or on social media. We have been on a long journey discussing mysticism infiltrating Christianity for a while now. We discussed contemplative prayer for some time, and the last episode, our discussion was on yoga. Today, we are turning back to the discussion of the creation and evolution debate. I know sometimes it may seem like no rhyme or reason to why I jump on one topic and then another very randomly, but simply said, it is because I read something and I want to share it. This past week, I was reading the book Cave of Bones by Lee Berger and John Hawkes. For those who are not familiar with the names of this title, it is about the Homo naledi discovery. For those who do not know about that discovery, it is one of the biggest discoveries in the field of paleoanthropology. It was a huge catch of bones found in a couple of chambers in a cave in South Africa. I have been researching this since the first day it was published about back in September 10th, 2015. I will hopefully wrap up my research soon on this discovery and publish a book I've been working on for years now. Obviously, I got a bit sidetracked with my work on Michael Heiser. Berger and Hawkes' new book was published in 2023 to hype up some of the new discoveries they published a few articles about in other more technical journals. The book is a popular level account of Berger's journey of losing weight to be able to squeeze into the cave chambers where these bones were discovered. I got to give him credit, first for losing the weight, and secondly for climbing into these caves. I felt claustrophobic just reading the accounts of his experience. At one point, he got stuck in a tight spot for over 40 minutes. I've taken my kids on a few occasions to locations so we can crawl around in caves, and I get to the point where if it doesn't look like I can comfortably turn around, I'm done and I'm heading back out. Berger is a lot bigger man than me physically, but I mean in the sense of being braver than me too. So what we will talk about today is not so much the Homo naledi discovery, but some interesting comments made in this book. I always find it fascinating when evolutionists confirm the biblical worldview, and this is one of those occasions. This particular portion of the book is written by John Hawkes, who is a professor of anthropology in Madison University here in Wisconsin. Before Professor Hawkes joined the team working with Homo naledi, his research was focused on genetics, seeking to understand how humans around the world are related to each other through descent from ancient groups. With this evolutionary presupposition, he is attempting to trace back to the time when all mankind shared a common ancestor and when specifically these different people groups diverged from the lineage of a common ancestor. Just to give you a quick summed up version of the evolutionary worldview concerning this topic, they would believe that our closest living ancestors would be chimpanzees and bonobos. Somewhere around 6 to 8 million years ago, a common ancestor branched off from that type ape kind, and some ape-like ancestors, something in relation to what we refer to as Australopithecus, evolved from an ape lineage. The Australopithecus is what most people are familiar with as the Lucy fossil. Now, of course, I'm skipping a bit of technicalities. There are various branches, including Ardipithecus, Pananthropus, Australopithecus, and what we refer to as Homo. Homo habilis, for example, is deeply debated by evolutionists as to whether it should be considered a Homo or Australopithecus. We have Homo erectus and Neanderthal is also a Homo grouping, among others. My major research on the Homo naledi is whether it is appropriate to group it as Homo or consider it Australopithecus. Again, I'm skipping over a lot of technicalities, but this is just a generalization to introduce the evolutionary worldview. Now, the Homo genus had allegedly um, arose around 2 million years ago. The DNA research is supposedly only picking up around 700,000 years worth of this history. Of course, I reject these dates as a creationist, but this is the evolutionary worldview. Picking up from here with this background information, I'm just going to quote John Hawkes. He writes in the book Cave of Bones on page 40, quote, "Now, DNA evidence can begin to enlighten the story, and it tells us that 3 ancient human lineages began to separate from one ancestral population around 700,000 years ago." Unquote. Well, that's interesting, isn't it? Besides the evolutionary dating here, what he just confirmed is a biblical worldview. The Bible would indicate that after a worldwide flood, Noah's 3 sons and their wives repopulated the earth. Biblically speaking, we should expect to find that DNA would imply that there are 3 main branches diverging from one main lineage. From Adam to Noah is one lineage, and the separation of Noah's 3 sons should be traceable because their wives would introduce diverging branches into genetics through uh, through mitochondrial DNA. But listen further to what John Hawkes has to say here. Again, on page 40, quote, "One of those lineages remained in Africa and ultimately evolved into the human species that we recognize today, modern Homo sapiens. The other 2 quickly sprang from a shared pool of founders into Eurasia, one heading west and the other east." Unquote. Interesting again. This is exactly what the Bible teaches. After the flood, the population began to grow, and they began to build the city of Babel with its tower. God judged the people and dispersed them across the earth by confusing their languages. So various family groups, a total of 70 different family groups dispersed from Babel, not Africa. And Genesis chapter 10 indicates that the descendants of Shem remained toward the Middle East, and some went further east. The descendants of Japheth went towards the northwest, or Eurasia, Europe, as Dr. Hawkes says, and the descendants of Ham went towards the south on into Africa. So far for the Bible, so far, the Bible would only disagree with the dates and the idea that this all began in Africa, which other evolutionists have challenged. Continuing with the comment from John Hawkes on page 40, quote, "The Westerners we call the Neanderthals, possibly the best known group of the entire early hominid tree. They inhabited the area from Spain to Uzbekistan, Poland to Israel, from more than 450,000 years ago up to around 40,000 years ago," unquote. So some people may get a little confused with the expression about Neanderthals being in Israel. Neanderthals are the equivalent of the Bible's descendants of Japheth, who went to Europe. Why would Hawkes say we find them in Israel? Especially since the Bible says the Canaanites were descended from Ham, who went south into Africa. To surprise many, John Hawkes is correct here, but by being correct, he is again confirming the Bible, which most Bible scholars are a little superficial in studying this aspect of the Babel migration here. In the book of Amos, God speaks about how he controlled the migrations of people groups. Amos 9:7 says, quote, "Are ye not as children of the Ethiopians unto me, O children of Israel, saith the Lord? Have not I brought up Israel out of the land of Egypt, and the Philistines from Caphtor, and the Syrians from Ker? So the point to be made here is that the Philistines are from Caphtor. They migrated to Israel and conquered the original inhabitants there. In Genesis 10, verses 13 through 14, we read the table of nations, which says, quote, and Mizraim begat Ludim and Enimim and Lahabemim and Naphtuhim and Pathrusim and Casluhim, out of whom came the Philistine, and Caphtorim, unquote. In verse 13, the name Mitzrayim is the Hebrew name that is translated as Egypt in the rest of the Bible. So we see that in context of the descendants of Ham, including the Egyptians, Ludims, elsewhere the Bible is indicating Africa, as well as the Philistines, that is the Philistines, and Caphtorim. So from this, we can understand the original descendants of Japheth did live in the area of Israel, as Neanderthal fossil evidence would confirm, and the Caphtorim migrated to Israel according to Amos 9:7 and took over the land, either killing off the Neanderthals, the children of Japheth, the descendants, or driving them out of and causing a specific group living in the area to migrate further north into Asia Minor and Europe, or Eurasia, as Hawks says. Actually, the term Eurasia is too broad because it would include a lot of the East that is properly to more properly for the route for Shem's descendants, more properly to route the Shem's for more properly the route of Shem's descendants. Though historically speaking, migrations continued to take place, so all these people groups eventually mingled with each other, as we will see even Hawks acknowledges. Continuing the quote from Hawks, beginning at the top of page 41, he writes, quote, the Easterns are more mysterious, known as Denisovans. Denisovans, their DNA was first discovered in 2010 from a bone fragment found in the Russia's Denisova cave. This DNA has been identified in only a handful of fossils, none of them skulls or skeletons, so we are still working to understand more about them, including where and when the population lived. A rich record of fossils found in China date to 700,000 to 400,000 years ago, show a population with brain size, brow ridges, and general body shape similar to those of Neanderthals or archaic African populations. And they may be found to be Denisovans DNA, to have Denisovans DNA, unquote. Here we find the fossil evidence a bit hazy. The fragments are so small, and the only evidence to DNA is the DNA discovered. Whether what was found in Russia is properly related to the lineage of Shem or Japheth cannot be determined. Migrations continue to take place throughout history, and eventually Japheth's descendants dominated what became known as modern-day Russia. The details of what was discovered in China has no actual DNA evidence to connect with the Denisovan group. Hawks is just speculating at that point. However, the eastern migration of Shem's lineage would include the population of the Middle East and the Jewish nation. But those who headed further east eventually went through Russia, crossing the Bering Strait into Alaska and down into the Americas. If the Denisovans prove to be descendants of Shem, it would be fitting the Bible, and I have no problem with the speculation Hawks presented, as it would be consistent with the Bible. The next paragraph, Hawks states, quote, these three geographically distinct populations, Neanderthals, Denisovans, and ancient African humans, evolved genetic differences over the time they existed, but they also exchanged genes with one another. Those genetic exchanges were greatest between the Africans and Neanderthals, Denisovans and Neanderthals also mixed. So today, it's no surprise that many people have a small fraction of DNA from these ancient groups. Separation and hybridization were both part of our journey. Unquote. Some notable points he makes in this paragraph are worth mentioning. First, these three distinct groups could all intermingle. That implies they were all human, just like us. Dogs cannot produce offspring with cats, and humans cannot produce offsprings with apes because we are genetically separated. But these three groups could all reproduce together, and their genetics can be traced in modern humans. So all three groups were human, not ape-like. Hawke says they evolved genetic differences. I would argue he is using the wrong word here. As a people group breaks off into a separate and distinct group, they limit their gene pool through reproducing with close relations. This causes an inheritance of mutations to increase. So, what Hawkes considers evolving differences should be accurately understood as the opposite, that is, devolving. It is a deterioration, a decline of good genes. It is genetic entropy that causes the differences in these people groups to arise. Evolution would imply an increase of new information, an upward climb, not a decline in genetic information. Hawkes used the word hybridization to describe the mixing of these three groups. This again is an inaccurate use of the word. As a population splits from a founder population, it will produce unique traits and eventually diverge into its own species. This we call speciation. What we identify as hybridization is when two distinct species commingle together. But this hybridization is qualified in the context of captivity. In other words, if two species mix together in the wild, they are not separated as species and their offsprings are not hybrids. A donkey and a zebra can be hybrids because in captivity they could mix, but in the wild they would not. A mule is a horse and a donkey mix. This should not be considered a hybrid because historically they are known to have mixed in the wild. Even Genesis 36, verse 24 says, quote, "And these are the children of Zibeon, both Ajah and Anna. This was the Anna that found the mules in the wilderness as he fed the asses of Zibeon his father," unquote. So mules are not a hybrid since they have bred together in the wild. They have been bred together in the wild. The evolutionary worldview would see that three lines of humans as distinct species, but they also admit that they intermingle. Their intermingling proves it took place in the wild, not in captivity, so they should not be identified with the term hybridization. Turning back to Hawke's quote on page 41, he says, quote, "That ability to mix suggests that all these ancient people could communicate with one another and could learn other cultures. The archaeological record confirms that they were alike in many of their behaviors that left physical traces, such as tools, animal bones, and campsites," unquote. He goes on to mention the use of fire, stone tools, hunting and gathering, as well as wearing ornaments and using natural pigments to dye things. These different people groups had an interest in art. Hawkes ends his comment saying, quote, "Sure, they look different, but their minds seem to have been very much alike," unquote. He is here discussing activities that we equate with humanity, not just survival needs, but aesthetics, creating things of beauty, which provide no purpose for survival. The archaeology goes beyond that to significance of religious thought and indicated from their burial sites. It is clear that these were all humans at the same level of comprehension skill intellectually, which we would not expect if these were independent lines of evolving creatures. Hawke says they could communicate and learn each other's cultures. They would have to learn different languages and cultures in order to mix. They were all obviously intelligent people. Now, I want to draw our attention to something that was written by creationist Brian Thomas of ICR back in May of 2016. He is referring to Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson's paper, which is posted at Answer in Genesis website, entitled On the Origin of Human Mitochondrial DNA Differences. New generation time data both suggest a unified young Earth creation model and challenge the evolutionary out of Africa model. That's a big title. It is a fascinating paper, but I'm going to quote Brian Thomas just because our short time left, and he sums this up quickly. Dr. Thomas post at ICR title is New DNA Study Confirms Noah. And it states, quote, Bible-believing molecular biologist Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson downloaded publicly available human mitochondrial genome sequence data to do exactly that, publishing in Answers in Research Journal. His results show that the number of today's mitochondrial DNA differences exactly matches the number predicted by the Bible's 6,000 years of human history. Mitochondrial DNA from around the world shows no traces of the 200,000 or so years worth of mutations that the evolution model predicts. Geneticists construct 3 diagrams using software that places the most similar genetic sequences near one another and the most dissimilar sequences on the longest branches. Jeanson found at least 2 distinct patterns in human mitochondrial DNA tree diagram that confirm Genesis. The center of the diagram shows 3 main trunks. Each reflects a specific mitochondrial DNA sequence with only a handful of differences from the other 2. Could these 3 trunks represent a unique mitochondrial DNA from the wives of Shem, Ham, and Japheth? A second pattern emerges that also fits the 3 wives explanation, assuming longer times between each generation according to the biblical record of lifespans before the flood and using today's slow mutation rate. The 1,656 years between Adam and Noah would have produced a small number of differences that the short lines between each trunk represent. Jeanson compared a small number of mitochondrial DNA differences between each trunk or central node with the relatively large number of differences in the branches. He wrote, and quoting Jeanson article, quote, about 1,660 years passed from creation to the flood, whereas 4,365 years passed from the flood to the present. Approximately 2.6 to 1 time ratio. Consistently with this, the branches connecting the nodes to one another were much shorter than the branches spraying out from the nodes, as if the short branches represented pre-flood mutations and the long branches represented post-flood mutations, unquote. And then Dr. Brian picks up saying this study produced 2 Genesis confirming results. First, the human mitochondrial DNA tree has 3 trunks, which fits the Genesis model that all people descended from 3 foundational mothers, the wives of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Second, 6,000 years of today's slow mutation rate would exactly produce today's measured number of mitochondrial DNA differences. Genetics again confirms Genesis, unquote. So Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson's work is updated and expanded from a paper referenced here by Dr. Brian Thomas into a book entitled Traced, Human DNA's Big Surprise, published in 2022. I haven't read it myself yet, but I did get a copy and I will interact with it sometime in a future podcast. The bottom line is what we see here is evolutionists essentially agreeing with biblical worldview. Despite their dating errors, much of what they have confirmed unintentionally confirms Genesis. The major differences between these 2 worldviews is that the evolutionists construct a highly speculative history from human history, while creationists actually follow a historical record that fits better with the evidence. Furthermore, the biblical history was revealed to us as the inerrant word of God and has been perfectly preserved record of history, so mankind can know our origins without speculative opinions of evolution that actually originated with pagan mythologies. This is Heath Henning. Thank you for listening to Truth Watchers podcast, and remember, hit the follow button or tell a friend to tune in. For more fascinating facts, check us out at truthwatchers.com, because sound apologetics and exegesis of scriptures is important for all of God's children, as is indicated in 3 John verse 4. I have no greater joy than to hear that my children walk in truth.